Hey guys, it's Pastor John from Coram Dale Church, taking a few moments to just respond to one of the questions that we got this last week from the sermon. We looked at Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 31. We noted that it's a very debated text and can be confusing, and also it's the most lengthy section of Jesus' teaching in all of Mark's gospel, and so all of that kind of perk our interest, and we spent some time looking at that and just invited you to ask questions in light of the reality that it can be a very confusing text. And so we did get one question, and so I'm going to take a second to go ahead and respond to it. The question is this. It says, I've always been taught and believe that Jesus was referring to his second coming in Mark 13. Your message was, as always, on point this morning. Very interesting and convincing interpretation of the text. However, is it possible that Jesus' words in Mark 13 are referring to multiple future events, i.e., the events which already took place that you spoke of and the second coming of Christ? So, a great question, and I think there's something worth noting in the question itself, and that is when it comes to issues specifically like things about eschatology or things about the end times, or even issues of what I would call the doctrines of grace. When we encounter a different perspective on a text, there's not just the text that we're engaging, we're also engaging our emotions, because people that we love and respect and look up to may have taught us things that are different that we're hearing somebody else teach us. And so it's really important as we engage each other on these kinds of issues, and eschatology is certainly one of those kinds of issues, that we are respectful and mindful that there's people that we love and people who certainly believe in the scriptures and love Jesus, who hold different opinions on what these texts are talking about, and so we should tread lightly. So I think that's a great reminder for us all. But to get to the question, is it possible that he's talking about future events as well as the events that were taking place in the immediate future of the disciples? And so let me try to answer that as clearly as possible. I think the vast majority of the verses 1 through 31 are specifically dealing with events that are going to take place in the immediate future of Jesus's immediate audience, meaning his disciples. So when he's talking to them about wars and famine and persecution, he talks to them about the false messiahs, the false Christ. And when he talks about the abomination that brings desolation, which Luke 21, he talks about it in different language because he's not speaking to people who have a Jewish background per se. He just talks about when the troops circled Jerusalem. That's what Jesus is talking about. I think that all of those events are events that are going to happen, and they're going to take place before, as Jesus says, before that generation, the generation he's speaking to, before that generation passes away. And all of the yous, when he says you will see and you will be handed over, and all of the language in the text seems to indicate that Jesus is speaking about things that are going to happen in the near future of his disciples. The one section that I can see maybe meaning something else would be it begins in verse 28, and it's where, or is it 24? It's where Jesus talks about you're going to see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. And I think I said this on Sunday, but when we hear the idea of the Son of Man coming on the clouds, I think because of the influences, which are primarily Western in terms of our thinking about eschatology and end times, I think every time we hear that, we think of the second coming. And when you look at that text, I think you can go, he might be talking about that in that text. And that is one of the sections in those 31 verses that I would say maybe he's talking about something else. But there's two reasons that I would suggest I don't think he's talking about primarily future events. One, it would seem weird for Jesus to be talking about immediate events that are going to take place before this generation passes, and then to jump forward to some future event, and then jump back into the present. It's almost as if he got distracted and went somewhere else, and now he's coming back to his main train of thought. And that doesn't mean that it's impossible that that's what it's about, but I think to me it's an indicator that that's probably not what he's thinking about. The other thing that influences me seeing that text as being about the immediate future of the disciples is that the Son of Man coming on the clouds is a statement that shows up in the book of Daniel. And one of the things I think that actually N.T. Wright is really good at is he really challenges us to say, let's make sure we're thinking as much as possible as much as we can like a first century Jew. So I don't want to necessarily import my assumptions of what coming on the clouds means. I want to be thorough and go, does the Bible talk about this? Are there other places where it's spoken of? And how would a first century Jew hear that? And so that's why on Sunday I was looking back to Daniel chapter 7, where it says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And there you have, that's exactly what Jesus is talking about in that that text in Mark. And it says, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And in Daniel, the coming of the Son of Man is not about the Son of Man coming to earth. It's about the Son of Man ascending to the throne in heaven, to the Ancient of Days. And so with that background, and when I read that section about the Son of Man, I'm inclined to think that Jesus is talking about the ascension, the victorious ascension. I think the they that he is talking about in that text is the powers, the stars that have fallen in the resurrection and ascension of Christ. The powers of darkness have been disarmed. They're falling. And as the gospel goes out and the church is established, that message, Christ is lifted up, and the powers continue to fall. So I tend to think that he's talking about at least primarily things in the immediate future of the disciples. However, let me say these two things, and I don't want to say too much because we're going to talk about this Sunday. But I do think, one, that what is established in Mark, at least the first 31 verses of Mark 13, could definitely be seen as a pattern for future events. So there's a way that things took place. And what Jesus is speaking to, I think, is the immediate future of his disciples. However, there's nothing to say that's not a template for what things might look like in the future. I'd be very comfortable saying these things actually happened, and it's kind of a rhythm of how it's going to happen in the future. I think that's certainly acceptable. I also would say, and again, we'll talk about this Sunday, but I do think that Jesus is talking about two events. One event in the immediate future of his disciples, and one event that still is in our future, and that's what the end of Mark 13 is pertaining to. And so, like I said, we'll talk about that this Sunday. So is it possible that he's talking about both? I do think it's possible. I think it's more probable that the first 31 verses are about the immediate future of the disciples, with the exception of the verses about the Son of Man coming on the clouds. I think you may have grounds for going either way with that, but I guess I'll tip my cards a little bit to you. I do think the end of Mark is about events that are in our future, and we'll talk more about that on Sunday. So thanks so much for taking time to ask the question. I hope this was helpful. If not, please do take time to email me personally, Jon, Jon, at quorumdalechurch.org, and we'll look forward to seeing you this Sunday at 9 and 10:45. All right, talk to you later.